So just to talk about a little bit of a case study that we put together here for you. This was for a company in which actually processed 10,000 new orders a month. And they had up close to about 20 FTE that were processing these initial order entries, right? So if you start on the left-hand page where it says client, there is really two paths the clients could take in order to submit their new orders. The top path was through an integrated portal, which you can see if you keep following it all the way through, already had an API connection into their legacy system, which means if they use that portal, the data just flows right into the system. That's fantastic. That's what we like to see. But for about 30% of the orders, they went through various different sources, including faxes and phone calls and emails. And then about 25% of them came through a bunch of ancillary non-integrated portals. They all like to use their own different portals to submit information, and they weren't API integrated into the core operating system. So there's about a team of 20 people that did nothing but take these roughly 3,000 orders a month and open them up and take information from those systems and put them into their legacy system. So we ultimately built a bot that actually could go to all those portals, log in, right, with their own login IDs, and take the information anytime a new order came in, take that information and place it over into the legacy systems. Now, you have to imagine there is quite a few of these different systems. The bot had login IDs for each one of those systems and would go and log in and making sure there's no new orders to be processed yet. And when there was, it would do its thing and take that information and place it over. So by doing that, we really freed up a tremendous amount of those FTEs and really allowed to allocate them back to some other revenue generation type of work for the organization. And there was still, a small number of FTE that still needed to handle some of those emails and phone calls and faxes that ultimately that were coming in. But you can see that this was a lot of orders coming in, a classic case where there was a lot of manual entry back and forth between the systems, easily put a bot in place to handle all of that.
Yeah, this was this is a bigger example of a project that saved millions of dollars a year in cost. They're not all have to be. We're going to show you more that are one bot that saves thousands of dollars instead of millions. But we wanted to show you this can be very sophisticated. It can also be very simple. So we'll kind of show you a little bit of both. This is a software by the numbers a little bit, and this is again another example because you might want to say, well, what's my return? That's always the first thing business owners like to ask. But this was a small business. Invoices were coming through a variety of channels. Then they were matched to purchase orders, and then they have to be approved by different people. Took about 6 hours a day to do this because it was a facility that was pretty large. Looking at the people that did it. With RPA, we created rules to match the invoice to the purchase order and send the invoices to the right person for approval, leaving only exceptions for the team to review. So in that case, they're going into a system for the invoices, a system for the purchase order, email, typing up the email, sending it, getting approval, etc. Ballpark, they were paying about $25 an hour. If you look at the all-in cost for that labor with taxes and if overhead costs, etc., is about $45 an hour. So if you take 6 manual hours a day, and I'm in the middle here, 6 manual hours a day, it's about 1,560 hours a year, so $70,000 spent on this process. In this example, we built a bot, and this is a monthly process or we try to set this up kind of on a monthly basis to make it cash flow a little better for our clients. There's a heavier lift in the front while we build and deploy the bot. So it costs them about $8,500 for the first 2 months and then $2,000 a month on a go-forward basis. So that's kind of the fully loaded cost on a go-forward. So on a cash flow basis, they're plus $42,000 in year 1, $46,000 in years 2, $46,200 year 3. So in a 3-year period, they saved $134,000. The investment was $76,500. So they have a 175% ROI. And what I think really resonates with people is the cost per hour for bots about $16 versus an all-in loaded cost of $45 an hour. The other thing that's really interesting about this too is this does not include benefit for them, as Jeremiah said, most of the time, and why does it boost morale? They get to go do thought-provoking work instead of copying and pasting and sending emails. When they go do that, that's going to provide additional lift that's not even built into this ROI. So it's really, you'll know better than us what the benefits would be of somebody doing that, but we didn't include it here because the math stands on its own already. But just want to make sure that you kind of understand that it's a pretty impressive solution. The other thing to note too, and Jeremiah is going to talk about this in a little bit probably again, but we typically don't automate all of it. There's always, everyone says, well, what about the rare scenarios? And honestly, in our line of work, we often hear about the exceptions. Our business is really built around getting the norm. Let's get the norm efficient, automated, flying high, and then let's let our experts deal with the exceptions. It's no different on RPA. It's going to handle the bulk of it, and then we're going to have our people that we need to make a decision, rationalize, etc. That's where they're going to spend their time, is on the exception, which is the minority of the time. So this is usually a slide that kind of helps resonate a little bit the potential and what it can do for your organization. Again, whether you're a 5-person company or a 500-person company, typically there's opportunity for automation with us or with someone else. Please look at this from an automation perspective.
So it's similar to this slide we talked about, those different use cases. If you're just thinking in the back of your head, where can I apply this? And what makes a good pilot process or process? I would start with an RPA. Here are just a couple of key attributes you should be thinking about that more likely will set yourself up to have success with RPA here. If the process is high transaction volume, right, and the high is obviously relative given the size of your business, but if it's something you do quite often, that's usually kind of the first place we like to look, where it seems a lot of transactions are occurring. If processing times tend to be above 3 or 4 minutes, that's also kind of a rule of thumb that we tend to look at in terms of processes. Now, if it's high transaction time and over 3 to 4 minutes, then I think we have really something good that usually produces a really great ROI. Also, if we just look at the hours a day someone's performing a task, right, we can help calculate sort of the benefits of RPA. Allowing manual process steps, that usually, lengthens the amount of time it takes to do it, so your processing time should correlate to that. If the process is just highly prone to errors, right, or defects, or it's a big compliance issue, like if we don't get this right, we could be under some regulation that we don't hit, right? Those sometimes are areas that if we have to get it right, we might want to put a bot in that particular area. And a lot of times organizations will look at it, it's just, our employees are just not fond of doing this task, right? It's repetitive, they don't like doing it. Then maybe that's an area where we can go boost employee morale and maybe just take that off of their plate, so again they can get allocated to do something a little bit different kind of going forward. And we're just going to make sure the process is relatively stable. If it's a process that's constantly changing or we're constantly doing different things with it, right, we want the bot to kind of follow these rules and repeat these rules on a regular basis. So if we're always changing the rules, right, we'll probably would have to wait to build the bot until we stabilize that a little bit. So these are some thought starters in terms of, if you have processes that kind of fit some of these areas, that's probably a good opportunity to at least consider RPA. How would that actually work if a company wanted to start to do RPA? And I think this is just a little bit of kind of the journey, or the adoption journey we take with the clients. And depending on how far you go from the journey really depends upon ultimately your strategy for really wanting to do RPA. But really we start on number one, which we just think about the organizational readiness, right? In terms of, does the organization, does the culture, does the stakeholders and leadership, do they understand what this change is going to be? Do we all have shared vision of why we're going to be doing RPA? And just want to making sure that the organization is ready from a change perspective. Because again, we can have the perfect solution that's going to solve your problems, but if the organization is just not open to new solutions, then we're kind of dead in the water to start off with. So assessing that organizational readiness is important. And then the next thing, once the organization is ready, then we look at operational viability, which means, do your processes in your type of business lend itself for RPA, right? And in some cases, some processes don't. If it's a manual process, but it's extremely subjective, right? There's not a lot of rules to follow and things like that. It may not be a great case for RPA. If the way you start a process, starts from 4 or 5 different areas, there's not one way of doing it, it may not be yet a great sort of operation for this type of work. So we want to make sure that operationally it does make sense. And whoever you work with should be the first one to say, hey, listen, I think there's a lot that we need to do with your process before automation is even a consideration kind of going forward. So after organizational readiness, then there's operational viability. And then usually if we get to this point and we think there are some processes we can do here, then we just talk about just doing your initial bot. Just do one initial pilot bot to demonstrate really the value of RPA. Because as you'll see on the next slide, right, there's going to be some things that need to be involved from like your IT infrastructure, right, and how we want the bot to interact with the various different systems. There's what's operations going to do, what changes do we need to make. So by going through that first bot, everyone from operations to leadership to IT understands how a bot ultimately will work inside our organization. And usually we see once that happens and once we deliver that first bot and they see the value, everyone's light goes off, and now pretty sudden, as Eric mentioned, right, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more bots ultimately that we can think of that ultimately we want to implement within the organization. And in some cases, a lot of our companies, they stay right there at that level 3. They want 3 or 4 or 5 bots, that's just kind of like they see that, but they really don't see growing their capabilities beyond that. But in other cases, we do have clients that say, listen, we want to scale up RPA. We want to grow this capability, right? And eventually turn it into what we call a center of excellence, where they may even want to take over some of this development and building bots on their own long term. In those cases, we can, you can help companies actually get to that capability and get to that center of excellence. Now we're going to be talking about governance. Now we're talking about various different controls, how you measure benefit realizations at the end. Those are some of the things that will come with the center of excellence, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. So talking a little bit about that center of excellence, what does that really look like? And again, not every client wants to get to a full center of excellence, but all of these elements take place at some level and at some level of detail, if you will, whether if you're doing 1 bot or 2 bots, or if you want to ramp up to building 50 bots over the next several years, right? So it always starts with sort of the strategy, right? And usually we set up a small steering committee. That could be just 1 or 2 people on your team, depending upon how big the company is, or it could be a team of 15 people. And we talk about what is our strategy? What are we trying to do with RPA? Are we trying to reduce costs? Are we trying to reallocate staff? Are we trying to boost morale? Is this a compliance or defect perspective? What's that strategy? And then ultimately, some level of governance and oversight to making sure that we are applying RPA to the right processes. So once we have that steering committee, then there's basically 2 major functions that we try to deliver. We have to talk about the network and IT and that environment, because at some point, either the company will want to host the bot within their network. A lot of times, a lot of companies don't have that infrastructure, so we have a secure cloud environment where we can host a bot to run it on behalf of the client. But we have to talk about what that environment would be, and then ultimately sort of how we'll build the bot for those clients. And then in parallel, there's also going to be operational processes. Are we identifying processes in which we want to use RPA? And then while we do that, we're trying to build the IT infrastructure. Now, around the operational processes, again, there's some viability testing that we should be doing in terms of making sure this process is viable for RPA, as well as the operational change management. So as the bot comes in and actually starts to perform tasks, for your team, for your operations, there is some change management. Sometimes employees like, well, what am I supposed to do now? Or, what's my job, right? We want to make sure we have conversations, we understand that impact ahead of time, and making sure we know how to allocate those resources appropriately if needed, right, to other parts of the organization. So operational change management is a big consideration here. And so as we do that and we start to deploy bots, then of course your performance and benefits tracking is key, right? Is the bot doing what it's supposed to do? Are we getting the lift and ROI that we thought we would from that bot? All of this comes into that center of excellence kind of mentality for RPA. And again, as we say here, Endurium or whatever company you choose to want to do RPA, they should be able to handle all aspects of this for you, so they can do as much or as little of this, on your behalf.